Wysokopреосвященний владико Борис, Всечесний Отче, преподобні сестри, шановні пані і панове, вітаю вас на наступнім викладі осередку праці наукового товариства імені Шевченка у Філадельфії. My name is Volodymyr Bazarko. I am the president of the Philadelphia chapter of the Shevchenko Scientific Society. And we are going to be having a lecture in the series of lectures with Metropolitan Borys Gudziak as the speaker. But before we start, I will ask all of you to rise so that we can honor the memory of those who perished at the hands of the brutal Russian invasion with a moment of silence. Thank you very much. To continue the program, I will ask Ulana Mazurkevich, the chair of the program committee of the chapter, to continue. Proszę pani magister Ulana.
Дуже дякую, доктор Базарко. Good afternoon. Slava Ukraini. I have the great honor to introduce the Archbishop Metropolitan Borys Gudziak, who will address us tonight on the year later, invasion, resilience, solidarity. The history of Archbishop Gudziak's life of service speaks clearly to his ability to give us insight, inspiration, and courage. His pastoral work as a young priest to his early vision for the birth of the Ukrainian Catholic University, his service as its rector, and currently as its president, his lifetime of commitment to teaching and empowering others through knowledge and faith, his passionate advocacy for Ukraine, whether in this hall or the halls of Congress. The many educational honors and professional responsibilities awarded, and so deservedly earned, his is a life of excellence through devotion to others. There are many people who could talk to us about the invasion. It is, after all, a subject that is foremost in the minds of Ukrainians and freedom-loving people around the world. But the invasion, in the context of resilience and solidarity, these words speak not just to the facts and figures, but to the harder path of day in, day out, refusal to succumb to despair, to staying true to our beliefs in the face of challenge and determination to stand shoulder to shoulder in solidarity and community. It is here that Archbishop Gudziak is so uniquely qualified to address us. In a life which glitters with accomplishments and honors, his persistent themes have been faith, resilience, service, believe in the power of goodness, and community to overcome adversity. And all of this with a sense of humor and joy that caused him, in the middle of his commencement address at Notre Dame University, to pause, pick up a football, and fulfill a lifelong dream by throwing a complete pass to the students. This sheer act of joy went viral. Please join me in welcoming Archbishop Vladika Metropolitan Borys Gudziak.
Good evening. Thank you for the invitation and the warm welcome. And I, first of all, would like to thank all of you. Does this work well? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear. Can you hear back there? No?
Yeah. Closer.
Is it? Oh.
I, first of all, would like to thank all of you for what you are doing for Ukraine, for the people of Ukraine, and for the world, because the topic at hand is a topic that will influence the rest of the 21st century. It is not only a question of Ukraine, but it is a question of Europe. It's a question of the free world. It's a question of democracy and liberty. And your presence here is just another sign of your engagement. What has happened in the United States, what the Ukrainian American and general American community have done, has had a singular impact on the developments of the past year. And you have been behind America's support and engagement, and I want to thank you for that. The distance from Philadelphia to Bakhmut is 5,082 kilometers. We don't hear the air raid sirens there or throughout Ukraine. We don't suffer the blackouts. If your ancestors left Ukraine in the 19th or early 20th century, or even after World War II, you do not necessarily have many relatives or friends who are on the front. The war may seem distant, even for Ukrainian Americans. Yet it is so close. For many of us, our Facebook is a constant obituary feed. Hundreds of photos of joyful, hopeful young men and women who have given up their lives, who've sacrificed themselves for something higher, for their country, for dignity, for freedom, for the innocent. 27-year-old Second Lieutenant Dmitro Kutsubailo, known by his call sign Da Vinci, was killed near Bakhmut on March 7th. His fiancée, Alina Mikhailova, has been the unit's medic, and she was the one who tried to resuscitate Dmitro. He died in her arms. He volunteered to the front line in 2014 when he was just 19. Da Vinci was a legend as a soldier, and many dignitaries, including President Zelensky, attended his funeral in Kyiv. Dmitro Pashchuk, also 27, was killed by a kamikaze drone in the Kherson region on March 12th. A scout, a platoon, a graduate of the so-called forest school, absolvent лісової школи, де він був першуном. Sometime after Easter, he was to get married with Hanna Gidula. You may remember her brother, Yuri, who was here for many years in the community. Last summer, this little group of friends lost Artem Demid, also a scout, a graduate of UKU, the son of Father Mikhailo Demid, who was here for the last 2 weeks preaching retreats. Artem's funeral was maybe the biggest of the funerals in Lviv, with over 1,000 scouts participating. Today we discuss the war, resilience and solidarity, and these might seem, kind of abstract notions. But I wish that we keep in mind that this war is very concrete. It kills many. It ruins so many lives. I hope that we keep in mind in our prayer the fallen soldiers, their fiancés, the loved ones, their parents, siblings, and friends. So, invasion. Those that know Ukrainian history know that it is not by any means a precedent, a first time. From the middle of the 17th century, what today is called Russian, then called Muscovite powers, regimes, have sought to conquer Ukrainian territory. They had been in history successful at different times. Ukraine became a cornerstone of the Russian Empire with its very fertile soil. Apparently, Ukraine can feed 500 million people, more than 10 times its own population. It has rich minerals. It has the Black Sea. It has mountains. It has an industrious, very well educated population. It is a society that produced, a country that built the biggest airplane. It had the biggest ballistic missile factory. It borders with many countries of the European Union. Present-day Russia has great nostalgia for this imperial past, for the reconquest of at least the 15 countries that broke out of the Soviet Union in 1991. This imperial consciousness is at the heart of the problem. It is the malady, the disease, the deep pathology that this war is addressing. According to the Russian 2010 census, there are as many as 193 ethnic groups in the Russian Federation. Some of them are small. Tribes of a few thousand people. But as we are now critically analyzing American, North American, Canadian history, as historians, ethicists, politicians, sociologists, specialists in cultural studies, as we in the church are critically analyzing the history of colonialism, we are coming to realize that everyone has a dignity and every culture has a right to exist. So many cultures have been trampled. So many nations and peoples were subsumed into empires. The 20th century, its history is actually largely a history of liberation from empire, of decolonization. If we look at some of the main trends and processes that are still continuing, there are struggles against European-based empires, empires that are long gone. The First World War brought about the demise of the Austrian and Ottoman empires. Eventually, the French, Spanish, Portuguese colonial system declined and fell apart. It took a while, it took many struggles, but the empire over which the sun never set, the British Empire, had to step back and allow for the self-determinations of people in North America, in Australia, in India, in Africa. And of these empires, it was only the Russian that remained. First Tsarist, then communist, and now the Putinist system, which pines for the past. Being 28 times as big as Ukraine is not enough. Having 11 time zones is not enough. The past empire needs to be rebuilt. So the Soviet Union was a continuation of the Russian Empire. And the Bolsheviks in modern times in the 20th century crushed all independence movements, whether Slavic, among those Ukrainian, the Baltic countries, the movements of those in the Caucasus. And then, in the living memory of most of us here, in the late 80s and early 90s, this empire began to crumble. And it was dismembered. 15 countries broke out. And it was Ukraine's vote for independence, when 90.3% of the citizens of Ukraine approved the Declaration of Independence on the referendum of December 1st, 1991, that the last nail in the coffin of the Soviet Union was put in. And on Christmas Day, December 25th, Gorbachev pronounced the dissolution of the USSR. It is important to remind ourselves of how overwhelming that vote was in Ukraine. 90.3%. In Crimea, it was 54%. In the Donetsk region, it was 84%. And it was 84% in Luhansk. That was the will. That was the vote. There are many details and many processes, but it is important to understand that already in the 1990s, Russian authorities began trying to reconstitute the empire, or at least make sure that the crumbling doesn't continue. So there were two devastating wars against Chechnya in 1994-96 under Borys Yeltsin, and then a war prosecuted brutally by the new president, Putin, which lasted 10 years until 2009. There were wars against Georgia, splitting up its territory. A separatist enclave created in Transnistria. The Nazis had their judgment, their condemnation after World War II. This is so important because nowhere in the world, in politics and culture, in social life, in education. Nowhere in business can you go forward as a Nazi. It is a taboo. Nazism has been condemned. It was analyzed, it was judged, and it was sentenced. This has never happened with Russian imperialism. This has never happened with Bolshevism. It has never happened with communism. And so we struggle, and so many of you have dedicated so much time in your lives to explain the genocidal waves in Ukrainian history. Although there are 2 billion people between Estonia and Albania and China and Vietnam that have lived or continue to live under communist rule, although tens of millions of people have succumbed to the terror regimes in different communist states, communism, Bolshevism, Russian imperialism do not carry the same taboo that Nazism does. We have known that there's a lot of work, and so many of you have dedicated your entire free time from youth to a ripe age to explain, speak about, and advocate. And yet I think it is a moment here, very much in this center, to realize that sooner or later the truth always prevails. If we go back into the mid-'80s and remember our struggles, if we remember our hopes, it seemed impossible that a superpower armed to its teeth with nuclear weapons would unravel. It seemed impossible that we could reconnect with relatives in Ukraine. We could travel there, they could travel here. It seemed impossible that our churches could be free, that Ukraine could be independent. It happened because God's truth does prevail, sooner or later. At that time, there was no war for independence, and some commentators say that this is that delayed war. That in the 80s and 90s, independence kind of dropped into the hands of Ukrainians who did not have the political, social, maybe ethical maturity to make the most of it. The 90s were a difficult period in Ukraine. The economy collapsed. So many people lost their jobs. The regimes allowed oligarchs to become instant billionaires. Many instant billionaires in the former Soviet territory became part of the regimes, the governments. And so we have seen in this context of independence but frailty and political responsibility, moments of incredible inspiration. You participated, even there, if not only here. The Orange Revolution, the Revolution of Dignity. All of these events were clarion calls for taking responsibility. calls that were inspiring, that were heard around the world, that were on the television screens, but moments which by many Ukrainians were considered unsustainable. At the same time, President Putin, who had made a fundamental moral option as a young person, as a teenager already hoping to become a member of the KGB, was told you have to wait, become an adult. He made an option to work in the structure that guarantees this authoritarianism, this totalitarianism. And he made an option which he has never stepped away from. If many of those who were born and formed in the Soviet time reconsidered the Soviet legacy and stepped away from it, President Putin has bemoaned the demise of the Soviet Union. Already in 2005, he called the collapse of the Soviet Union as the worst catastrophe of the 20th century. First and foremost, it is worth acknowledging, Putin said, that the demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. As for the Russian people, it became a genuine tragedy. Tens of millions of our fellow citizens and countrymen found themselves beyond the fringes, beyond the borders of Russian territory. Included in those tens of millions are Ukrainians. In the winter of 2007, Putin spoke at the Munich Security Conference about the imaginary threat of NATO expansion for Russia. I think it is obvious that NATO expansion does not have any relation with the modernization of the alliance itself or with ensuring security in Europe. On the contrary, it represents a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust. And we have the right to ask, against whom is this expansion intended? And for the following 15 years, Putin answered this question and put it in the heads of people even like Henry Kissinger or Professor Mersheimer in Chicago. It is against Russia, this expansion. It is a threat. Don't do it. So many politicians, so many analysts came to believe that it was maybe this expansion that provoked Putin. This war waged by the Russian president is not a war just of the Russian president. 60% of Russians support the war against Ukraine, according to surveys of February of this year. Of course, we need to take this information with a grain of salt, as independent sociological surveys are impossible in a totalitarian country. And some experts state that the Russian regime works very hard to create an illusion of the majority. But there is very little protest, very little alternative opinion. 700 university rectors signed a document, a statement of support from the war. Can you imagine that? 700. We in the US, I think, have, in college sports, I think there's 250 Division I schools. Imagine 700 institutions of higher learning with their leadership support this war. Out of 300 Russian Orthodox bishops in Russia, not a single bishop has spoken out against this war. And Patriarch Kirill, many leading hierarchs, many leaders amongst the clergy are enthusiastic, emotional supporters of the war effort. Some say Putin has not done enough. Just in the past days, one priest who was born and raised in Lviv exhorted the Russian soldiers to say a special prayer as they are loading the cannons and other artillery against Ukrainians. Between 70 and 80% support President Putin as president, agree with his general policies. Yes, maybe even as many as 1 million Russians have left, especially at the time of the mobilization in last September. But we don't see too many Russian protests in Philadelphia and Washington and Berlin and Rome against this war. In fact, we see many Russians outside of Russia doing protests that are counter-protests to those in support of Ukraine. The problem is deep. It's a pathology. My colleague at UKU, Yaroslav Hrycak, says the following: in the minds of many Russians, Russia is not just another country. It is a country with a great mission, namely to save the world from the corrupting influence of the spoiled West. For this reason, all things Russian must be great. Its territory, its army, even its language has to be great and mighty. Neighboring nations who reject this great mission are at best silly children in need of education, at worst scoundrels and traitors who must be decimated, deported, etc. In either case, they cannot be left to their own devices to sort out their own fate. This war, I need not remind, I think the members of this audience, did not start last year, it started in 2014. That's when Da Vinci joined. And in the first 8 years of the war, there were more than 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed. We remember Ilovaisk, Debaltseve, the Donetsk airport. And then in February 21st in 2022, Putin made explicit his intentions about the upcoming full-scale invasion. He basically said Ukrainians are nothing, they were nothing, and they will be nothing. Something like the Valuyev Ukaz in the 19th century. Не було української мови, нема і не буде. There was no Ukrainian language, there is no Ukrainian language, and there never will be a Ukrainian language. You have no statehood. You are worthless. You are a failed country. These are the ideological constructs that are being used to explain, justify this genocidal war. It is a military operation to denazify. Денацификация неизбежно будет являться и деукраинизацией. The denazification necessarily has to become a de-Ukrainianization. Ukrainianism is naturally a artificial anti-Russian construction that has no proper civilizational content. And it is created by foreign and aggressive civilizations that are geared to work against Russia. So many of us have been guided in understanding the depths of this genocidal policy by Professor Timothy Snyder of Yale University, who 2 days ago spoke at the Ukrainian Catholic University, had a seminar around a new book he's publishing. He sent the book to 9 UKU faculty. They read it, and then they had a discussion so that his theses could be developed more precisely. And then he had a meeting with the general university community. So, according to the Genocide Handbook that appears in different forms and publications in Russia, any attempt to build a Ukrainian state has to be a Nazi act. Ukrainians are Nazis because they failed to accept the necessity that the people really support Russia. So anybody that says Ukrainians are Ukrainians, that Ukrainians don't want to be Russians, is by definition a Nazi. Ukrainians should suffer for believing that they exist as a separate group. Only this suffering can lead to the redemption of their guilt. It's one of the most openly genocidal statements that one can read. It calls for the liquidation of the Ukrainian state and for abolition of any organization that has any association with Ukraine. It postulates, Snyder says, that the majority of the population of Ukrainians are Nazis, which is to say Ukrainians. Such people, i.e. the majority of the population, so more than 20 million at least, are to be killed or sent to work in labor camps to expurgate their guilt for not loving Russia. Survivors are to be subject to re-education. Children will be raised to be Russians. The name of Ukraine will disappear. This is from an article entitled "Что Россия должна сделать с Украиной?" What should Russia do with Ukraine? There are so many signs of the genocidal intent, and I refer you to the different publications of Timothy Snyder and his YouTube presentations. What are the casualties of this war? Officially, the Office of the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights has recorded 8,317 killed and 13,892 injured civilians. But this office itself says that the actual figures are considerably higher. We do not know. Nobody knows. But I believe that there have been more than 250,000 people killed, including soldiers on both sides. In Mariupol itself, those who are close, those who evacuated and continue to evacuate people from occupied Mariupol, believe that at least 20,000 people perished in that city. But it could be 2 or 3 times more. On the Ukrainian side, martial law does not allow for the disclosure of information about military casualties. But if you go to Lviv, and I've been there 6 times since February 22, just at one cemetery, there's more than 300 fresh graves. And it's particularly painful when you go to the graves of your students, of people you know, of the children of your friends. In terms of humanitarian dimensions, 1/3 of the entire Ukrainian population has been uprooted. More than 8 million refugees from Ukraine have been recorded crossing into Europe. Right now, it is said that there are 5.5 million internally displaced persons. In the spring, it was 7 million. Returning back on one of the trips and landing in New York and walking the streets of the Big Apple, I suddenly realized I didn't see this in Ukraine. I didn't see people on the street. It is truly amazing that 7 million, at least now 5.5 million people have been absorbed, have been helped, welcomed. Because the people are in homes. They're in some kind of institutions. They're not in giant refugee camps. The poor people of Ukraine are sharing everything they have. There are no people on the streets. There are not people dying. And in this winter, despite all the efforts of Putin, people did not die of exposure in Ukraine. Women and children make up over 90% of the people fleeing. It is estimated that Russian authorities have deported between 900,000 and 1.6 million Ukrainian citizens to Russia. And of course, last week, the International Criminal Court, or 2 weeks ago, issued an arrest warrant against Putin for the deportation of children, something that is one of the characteristics of genocide. A Yale team has verified at least 6,000 Ukrainian children detained by the Russian government, although researchers believe that there are thousands more. Their report identifies 43 camps, and 11 of these camps are located more than 500 miles from Ukraine's border with Russia, including 2 camps in Siberia and one in Russia's Far East. Again, Ukrainians deported to the place of the white bears. Approximately 17.6 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance this year. The damage to all kinds of infrastructure is overwhelming. 10 million hectares, that's I think over 20 million acres of Ukrainian agricultural land has been degraded. It is estimated that it will require $15 billion to remove all the mines, the landmines that have been put in Ukrainian soil, and restore Ukraine's soil to its former health. Some estimate that the territory that is mined is greater than the size of Britain. Direct damage caused to the infrastructure of Ukraine due to the war is approximately $138 billion. 150,000 residential buildings have been destroyed. 131,000 private homes, 17,500 apartment buildings, and 280 dormitories. The total number of damaged or destroyed educational institutions is more than 3,100, including 1,500 schools, almost 900 kindergartens, and 500 buildings of institutions of higher learning. 1,200 healthcare facilities, among them 362 hospitals. The business damage is estimated at 13 billion. Almost 200,000 private cars have been damaged or destroyed. 494 religious buildings, theological institutions, and sacred places were wholly destroyed, damaged, or looted by the Russian army. And yet, Ukraine has issued a wake-up call to the world. Nobody predicted. Ukraine was supposed to collapse in a matter of days. The Russians were hoping to have a triumphant march through Kyiv already on February 27th. The soldiers brought parade uniform. At first, Americans and the European Union were reluctant to give weapons, fearing an Afghan scenario, that all these weapons would fall into the hands of the Russians. They proposed to the president of the country to leave. Apparently, the Washington Post's fact checkers have not been able to confirm the authenticity of the phrase, "I need ammo, not a ride," tweeted by the Embassy of Ukraine to the UK. But it remains the most eloquent resume of the attitude of the Ukrainian army, government, society in the first days and weeks of the invasion. What is behind this? Something that almost no one predicted. Dignity, truth, eternity. Already on the Orange Revolution Maidan, the Maidan of the Revolution of Dignity in 213, 214, we could feel this solidarity, this generosity. You know, Kyiv is a big, big city with all the characteristics of a 21st century metropolis. Imagine standing out in the cold and hearing a conversation. "I just arrived. You've been standing here for a long time. Here are the keys to my apartment. I don't know you, you don't know me, but go and just rest, warm up, have a meal in my house." The incredible solidarity that was actually something that transcends normal human experience. But that which was experienced and felt on both of these Maidans, and these Maidans actually were replicated throughout the world. They were here in Philadelphia as well. This phenomena was considered exceptional, unsustainable, and maybe ultimately not consequential. Many people, remember, said, "We failed. We failed." Nothing was accomplished by these Maidans. Nothing has been accomplished. Some of us I'm glad it's not a aerial alert. So many people expressed profound disappointment that the Maidans achieved nothing. Everywhere I went and spoke on this topic, I tried to contradict it. Because I was convinced that there were deep seeds and roots that were coming from these experiences. This, at the Maidan, you could sense that people were defending something sacred. It started out as a Euromaidan, but it became a Maidan of dignity. At the Ukrainian Catholic University, we reflected for years about human dignity. It's in the mission statement of the university. Shortly before the second Maidan in Kyiv, I had a talk about how much is our dignity worth? How much does it cost? Скільки коштує наша гідність? This is a conversation that in one form or another was held for a century. You participated in it. You were students in the school. There were numerous sources. But for your reflection, allow me to propose that one of the most important was Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky, who in the late 19th century, personally was acquainted with Pope Leo XIII, who enunciated in a modern way Catholic social doctrine. Developed over the next 100 years to have 4 basic principles: God-given human dignity, solidarity, subsidiarity, which means bringing things to a lower level and giving many people responsibility and authority, not looking just for solutions from the top. And the 4th is the common good. And Metropolitan Andrei, over a lifetime, he was head of the church for 44 years, in a very concrete, understandable, popular way, spoke about these fundamentals, issuing short pastoral letters, but also incarnating them in institutions that today are reflected in our credit unions, in economics, in a solidarity and concern for the general common good of the poor people in his flock. It is with this school that the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church entered the underground. It was being rendered illegal beginning in 1939. During the war, Sheptytsky took this message outside of just the Ukrainian community, and this was behind his efforts to save Jews during the Holocaust. And the church took this message into the underground, when for 45 years it was the biggest illegal church in the world. It had no chance. It was reduced in terms of clergy by 90%, from 3,000 to 300 in 2 generations. And those participating in the underground were only 1% of the pre-war population, because each of the 300 priests could maybe reach 100 people. That's 30,000 out of 4 million. Those who were in Kyiv on the Maidan in 2004 know very well that the majority of the Maidan was from Galicia, from Western Ukraine. The proportion was maybe a little different in 2013 and 2014, but it was still a plurality of people from Western Ukraine. And they were carrying the message of this school. of social thought. In fact, today, the whole country is learning from this school, implicitly or explicitly. Someday I want to sit down with President Zelensky and explain to him how he himself became a student of this school. Because we remember his platform, or the lack thereof, his rhetoric 4 years ago when he was running for the presidency and achieved it. It was something very different. There has been a profound conversion in Ukraine. You hear it, read about it. Many people making a conscious decision to switch from speaking Russian to speaking Ukrainian. Of people moving from one ecclesial jurisdiction to another. But most importantly, of people helping each other and people willing to risk their lives for principles, dignity, truth, eternity. There are 20 wars going on in the US, in the world today. And for some reason, the war against Ukraine remains at the center of the world's attention. If you look at CNN or Deutsche Welle or France 24, BBC, almost every day there is a Ukrainian war lead. It's a little less than it was 3 or 6 months ago. Actually, a couple days ago, there was a day when there wasn't a Ukrainian war lead. But it comes back. And hats off in full respect to the journalists of the world, a number of whom have given their lives. What is it that mesmerizes the world's attention? Why this war? People at some level realize that it's not just Ukraine. Europeans, especially Poles and the Balts, the Georgians, the Slovaks, the Romanians, realize that Ukrainians are dying for their freedom. They have an interest in this, but there is something deeper. We live in a time of profound deconstruction. The deconstruction of many things, many unjust social patterns. Racism being something that we in Philadelphia have been confronting, particularly in a new way after the murder of George Floyd. We have been deconstructing with abandon. There is profound detraditionalization in the global culture. There's actually a great skepsis about the fact, about the very existence of truth. Well, there's your opinion and there's my opinion. Those who have studied French philosophy or literary theory, called postmodern, know that there is great skepsis about the existence of truth. Truth is ultimately transactional. You can buy it, you can sell it. Media, politics, diplomacy, and popular culture are conditioned by a post-truth anti-ethic. You know, there's like facts, and then there's alternative facts. And Ukrainians are saying, not so fast. Not everything is up for grabs. There is good and there's absolute evil. There is truth and there are lies. And you know what? I'm willing to risk my life for it. That, my friends, I think is at the heart of this focus. People willing to risk their lives and say, my body, my little chronology is not the ultimate criterion. There's something besides. There's those I live with. There's my children, my parents, my neighbors. There's my city, there's my country. And there are values and verities. And for some of them, it's worth giving your life. Already in 213, 214, when I lived in France, I could see the bewilderment of Europeans who saw Ukrainians give their lives for the European flag. Give your life? Really? For a flag, for principles? It's an incredible wake-up call to the world. Ultimately, I believe that people who give their life have an innate or maybe very explicit faith in eternity. Most of our civilizations, the Judeo-Christian world, the Muslim world, the civilizations on all continents have had deep at their core a sense of the spiritual identity of human beings. We're just not biological automatons. We're just not a conglomeration of chemistry and physics. We have a soul. And that there is life after death. I believe that many, if not all, of those who go to the front believe that their death is not the end. They say that there are very few atheists in foxholes. But the fact that so many Ukrainians are willingly putting themselves in ultimate danger is focusing the world's attention on what is happening in Ukraine. Incredible unity, incredible generosity. You've seen the figures, you know the names. The different funds, the Pletula Fund, United 24, Come Back Alive, and all of the funds that have been in our communities. "81% of respondents in Ukraine say they've donated for the Ukrainian armed forces, even though 95% say they don't have enough money to live comfortably. 63% donated essential items for internally displaced persons. 60% of respondents in Ukraine donated money to humanitarian aid. And more than half have provided shelter or aid to IDPs. This devotion to your neighbor is beyond just calculation or self-interest. On the day of the Iranian drone attack, the first one in the center of Kyiv in October, people in Ukraine donated more than $5.6 million to buy kamikaze drones for the Ukrainian army. More than 90% of Ukrainians believe in victory. Almost very few Ukrainians are ready to trade territorial concessions for peace. The saying goes, if Russia stops fighting, the war is over. If Ukraine stops fighting, there is no Ukraine. So Ukrainians have demonstrated a solidarity and they've inspired a solidarity. USAID has provided $13 billion in direct budget support to make sure that the salaries of school teachers, doctors, and other state employees are continued, as well as the pensions. $1.4 billion in humanitarian assistance has already been provided to save lives and meet the urgent needs of the Ukrainian people. And over $800 million for development assistance to bolster Ukraine's energy grid, which Russia has been attacking. Catholics in Ukraine, by my estimation, have donated $250 million, $250 million, through various organizations. Just Catholic Relief Service has collected $120 million. The Knights of Columbus, over $20 million. Ordinary people in the pews are contributing to many different funds. One example of solidarity which is drawn from the generosity of the general American population is our Metropolitan Humanitarian Aid Fund, which has collected over $8 million. 100% of these contributions, 100% of the contributions are going for aid, not a penny for administration. We haven't even paid for the envelopes. No staffing other than our modest staff at the Chancery. A large portion of this, $2.9 million, has gone to the IDPs, $1.7 million has gone for medical aid, $670,000 for church ministry, 120 chaplains, military chaplains, and 137 medical chaplains have been supported. $630,000 for emergency food aid. Half a million has gone for logistics to bring things in and out, people in and out of the danger zone. We had 7,600 donations from 12 countries, 32 Catholic schools, 16 Roman Catholic dioceses, 2 universities, 1 Jewish organization, 8 Eastern Catholic eparchies. The Diocese of Houston gave $806,000. The Diocese of Boston, where I was yesterday, gave $500,000. And both of these dioceses have said you have to set up a fund for rebuilding. So $1 million of this has been set up for a rebuilding fund. Many of you are veterans of the long pilgrimage. Some of you, I think, were carried out in the hands of your parents during a devastating war when 7 million people were killed in Ukraine, World War II. Many of you have spent a lifetime in this struggle. Never before has the world been so Ukrainian. Never before has so much in the world's destiny is being decided in Ukraine. Although now scholars like Timothy Snyder, who I've mentioned, are reconsidering European history and realizing that, in fact, in World War I and World War II, Ukraine was one of the epicenters. The way Ukraine goes, the way the flow of history goes. And so it's so important for us to pray, because there is a spiritual, deep spiritual moment. Prayer moves mountains. We see miracles. We've seen miracles. We saw the Soviet Union fall. It's so important to advocate, to understand, to explain, to be informed. And it's so important to act, to help. So I end with what I began. I want to thank you, many of you, for a lifetime of activity, of commitment. of studying the history, of preserving the language, of carrying the culture, of creating and maintaining the institutions. It is this work in the United States that bolsters general American support for Ukraine. Yes, it is true, Ukrainians are doing the most difficult work. Yes, it is Ukrainians that are giving their lives. But today, this struggle is impossible without American support. And you are the Americans that have been explaining to our countrymen what it is all about. May God reward you 100-fold. Thank you.